The history of women's rights, and some of you don't, and I was asked to kind of do a dash through women's history, although in fact the women's history movement in America has been a marathon, not a sprint. If we're going to really look though for the ideal situation, we should really look to Egypt. Unfortunately, that's ancient Egypt, not contemporary Egypt, because in ancient Egypt, women had parity with men. Women had the same legal and economic rights, and this is documented in Egyptian art and manuscripts. Women could manage, own, and sell private property, including slaves, land, portable goods, servants, livestock, and money. Women could receive legal settlements. And indeed, the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited ancient Egypt, commented on how different it was from life in Greece. He said, women attend the markets and trade, while men sit at home and weave. If you really want to know the status of women in the countries around the world, the best place to go is the Global Gender Gap Report. Is anybody here from Iceland? Because Iceland has topped the charts for 4 years running. Then I have Scandinavian background, so I'm happy to report. Next is Finland, Norway, Sweden, and then interestingly enough, Ireland. 82 out of 132 countries have improved equity slightly over the last year, including US, Japan, and Germany. But things have widened in the UK and China. But there's a big push at the global level to look at talentism instead of capitalism, talentism. And women, of course, are half the talent. And how can a country prosper if the talent of women are ignored? So this is a key driver in competitiveness, and it's really in people's own interest to really figure out how to tap into the talents of women. So in my sprint through US women's history, I thought I'd look at what are the qualities of a leader that each of these different women or groups shown. There were men involved, men of principle, so I'm glad to see men here too. First, vision. My favorite shero, Margaret Fuller. I don't know how many of you have heard of her. She was really the philosopher and the thinker. And she was in the early part of the 19th century. In fact, she published a bestseller in 1845 called Women in the 19th Century. And it sold out in a week. She was an amazing woman. She was a friend of Emerson and Thoreau. She was the editor of The Dial. She was a journalist in New York and eventually went to Italy. And she had the idea, the radical idea, that there should be equality of work opportunity. In fact, her famous saying is, let them be sea captains if they will. So I don't know how many sea captain opportunities there are today. But she also had the idea that privileged women should help the less privileged. So she's a really wonderful icon, and there's a lot of books about her. One of them is this recent biography. And of course, you can Google any of these women and learn much more about them. My second icons is really two women who I really laud for risk-taking. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. We already heard from our introducer about the excitement of Seneca Falls in 1848. They just gave a few days' notice and over 300 men and women showed up. And the radical idea they had was to rewrite the Declaration of Independence and call it a Declaration of Sentiments, and that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. So it was a radical idea to add the word "and women." They also were advocates, although it was quite radical at the time, to seek the right to vote. Some people thought that was really pushing it, to think about giving women the right to vote. And that was signed by 68 women and 32 men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Then I have to throw in for passion Sojourner Truth. I don't know how many of you know her. She was a slave who took the name of Sojourner Truth because she was a preacher. And she had passion. She wanted to fight for truth and justice. And of course, a lot of the idea of people who were wanting to keep women down was that we want to protect you. So Sojourner Truth spoke in 1854 at the Ohio Women's Convention, and she gave a very famous speech called "Ain't I a Woman?" And she said, you know, that man over there says women need to be helped into carriages, but nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could overdo me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and hear the lash as well, and ain't I a woman? So she is a really wonderful model, and her biography was published, and she lived off the proceeds of her story. Then for persistence, of course, we have to keep in mind Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. You know, the fight for women's right to vote took 72 years. You know, Susan B. Anthony gave 75 to 100 speeches a year for 45 years. She was an organizational genius. She voted and was arrested for voting in 1872. So their theme was men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less. Well, the real challenge came when Alice Paul came back from England and decided to have a team, really have a dramatic team building of women. And she, before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson on March 3rd, 100 years ago, decided to have a parade. There were 5,000 women in this parade. And they were using political theater to gain influence. Of course, they were attacked by men for having the temerity to speak up for their rights, and the police stood by, and women were beaten. Then she had the clever idea, for the first time, to hang out in front of the White House. And they were the first people to really be silent sentinels in front of the White House. And for that, they were jailed and sent to a prison workhouse. And there's a new historic site in Virginia that honors the place where they were imprisoned. They were force-fed, they were beaten, but they knew about public relations, and they got publicity for this mistreatment. And there was such a public outcry that President Wilson reversed his position and supported women's right to vote. So finally, the 19th Amendment was passed, as we heard already, in 1919 and ratified in 1920. But of course, Alice Paul believed this was just the beginning. So she had another radical idea, the Equal Rights Amendment, that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. This is where I came in. Not that I was a friend of Alice Paul's, but I didn't meet her. But I did come to Washington from Nebraska in 1972 to advocate for women's rights. And one of the reasons I was valuable as someone from Nebraska as a grassroots was that Senator Roman Ruska had a lot of sway on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And we were able to put pressure on him in Nebraska to support the Equal Rights Amendment. And when we finally reached him, he said, "Of course I support it." I said, "Well then, Senator, it would be good if you showed up at the committee and voted it out of committee." So it was voted out of committee. It was voted out of the Senate and the House, and Nebraska was the second state to ratify it. The sad end of the story is there was a big opposition to this, and still the ERA has not been ratified. But we are still hopeful. And of course, we've had some favorable Supreme Court decisions that have given us more rights. Another leadership skill is networking, and for that I've got to speak out for my own organization, the American Association of University Women. You do not have to be a university professor, but you have to have a university degree. And the reason was that in 1881, when these women were graduating from college,